At the turn of the 20th century, America was a land of limitless possibility. The skyline rose with steel and ambition, bold, daring, and unstoppable. Fueled by the American dream, small-town entrepreneurs built companies that reshaped industries and uplifted their communities. Innovation became the heartbeat of our nation. In 1912, local business leaders united with a shared purpose: to create a single voice dedicated to defending free enterprise, empowering businesses to serve people, provide solutions, and strengthen society. That voice became the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, committed to advancing economic freedom and opportunity for every American. For over a century, we've been a driving force at the crossroads of progress, shattering barriers, fueling growth, and creating opportunities for people building better lives. We don't just support business, we ignite it. From local startups to global enterprises, we create an environment where potential thrives, empowering communities, leaders, and creators to transform bold ideas into lasting impact. Working with and for a local, national, and global federation of partners, we fight for American businesses in the courts, in state capitals, in Washington, and on the world stage. Steadfast in our principles, unwavering in our resolve, uncompromising in doing what's right. This is America's story, written with vision, bound by conviction, illustrated through courage, and enriched by the hard work of everyday people, local business owners, and global visionaries who continue to define us. It's an enduring legacy of strength, determination, and shared ambition. One we proudly build upon as we work to write the next chapter of our nation's story. Join us. Together, let's build a future of growth and opportunity for the pursuit.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of the Free Enterprise Exchange. So as you just saw in the video, defending, protecting, and advancing free enterprise is the U.S. Chamber's nearly 114-year mission. And we created this platform to address common myths, to explore emerging trends, and provide timely insights that will help all of us promote and uphold the values of the free enterprise system. For today's dialogue, we're going global. We will focus on how international trade and globalization improve living standards for people and communities across this country and around the world. Of course, this is a timely topic and there are plenty of misconceptions to address. Leading the conversation will be Neil Bradley, the Chamber's Chief Policy Officer and Head of Strategic Advocacy. And we're delighted to welcome our very special guest today, Scott Lincicome, the Cato Institute's Vice President of General Economics and the Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Scott is, of course, one of the foremost writers and thinkers on international and domestic economic issues, such as trade, subsidies, industrial policy, manufacturing, global supply chains, and economic dynamism. Scott is also a senior visiting lecturer at Duke University Law School, where he's taught a course on international trade law. Now, you've probably seen, read, or heard his commentary in the media, where he regularly appears on radio, on TV, and in print. And we're really grateful that today he's bringing that expertise and that perspective to the Free Enterprise Exchange. Over the course of the discussion, we want to hear from the audience too. At any time, you can submit your questions using the link in the description box that's helpfully labeled Submit a Question. Just click the link and share your thoughts with us. We'll hear from Neil and Scott first, and then we'll begin addressing audience questions around 1:35. We'll take as many as we can up until we wrap around 1:45. So with that, let me turn things over to Neil and Scott.
Well, Courtney, thank you. Scott, thanks for joining us. I share Courtney's enthusiasm. I have to say, I haven't taken your class at Duke, but I feel like I get a master class following you on X, on the merits of trade and free market economics. And so I encourage everyone to join us today. If you don't follow Scott on X, you will definitely get your money's worth if you do so. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start actually at the beginning. Why does free trade matter? Why should we even care whether we have a free trade system that the United States participates in?
Yeah, I mean, where I always start is with the word free. When individuals are free to pursue their own interests as consumers or producers or exporters or importers or whatever, good things happen. There is a strong relationship between economic freedom and not just economic prosperity, but and higher living standards and those type of things, but also health and happiness and all the types of things we want for ourselves and for our country. So from there, though, let's face it, there's a boatload of literature, history books, economics papers, you name it, on the many, many benefits of free trade in particular, and how it is one of really the driving forces behind the success of the U.S. economy. The United States is, or was, one of the most open economies in the world. Certainly not perfect, and we and Cato have noted that, but we're pretty darn good. And over that long period of openness, we've seen really dramatic improvements in not just economic growth and GDP and wages and those types of things, but a lot of other things that really matter to us all. And of course, as you guys know perfectly well, we are home to some of the biggest and best, most innovative, productive companies in the world as well, including in cutting edge industries and healthcare and the rest. So, you start kind of with that stuff. And then there are so many other potential, I think, important issues that trade touches on, right? The fact is that trade is also a tool of foreign policy. The original U.S. global trading system was not really about tariffs and trade. It was about foreign policy, about staving off another world war. And so the United States got together with some other countries and built a global trading system on the idea that non-discriminatory and sort of mostly free trade among nations would help preclude armed conflict between those nations. And that's been mostly the case over the last 70 plus years. Countries that trade with each other tend not to go to war with each other. Trade has also been a massive vehicle for improving global poverty, which is important not just for, of course, the world's poorest people, but also for us in terms of security and stability here in the United States. And then finally, look, I'm a inherent natural libertarian guy, a small government guy. I'm not a big fan of cronyism. And the fact is that there is a really strong connection between protectionism, so the opposite of free trade, and government cronyism and corruption. Some of the earliest lobbying and interest group politics in the United States stemmed from like 19th century tariff policy. And I, as a former trade lawyer, saw firsthand how you scratch a protectionist measure and you found some crony or interest group or lobbying group underneath. And so for me, there's an extra political element to all of this. But I think that's also important, again, for a good and well-functioning economy. You don't want politics driving the bus. You want individuals and companies and markets.
Yeah, it's a question of fairness, right? So, if rather than fairly competing in the market, if the government is using trade policy to pick a winner and loser, it's not exactly fair. And
right. And the companies, even companies that don't want to get involved with the government, feel compelled to do so because their competitors are doing so. And so you end up seeing companies spending on lobbying and not on actually their own businesses. And that can, again, redound to the real economy beyond just it being unfair.
Yeah, and I think we're going to explore some of these issues more when we talk about what's currently happening in trade. But before we get there, I want to spend just one more minute on kind of the foundational aspects of it. I think most of our audience knows that next year is America's 250th birthday. They may not know that it's also the 250th birthday of the Wealth of Nations, right? And Adam Smith famously wrote about the guy who's trying to build a house and he's making his own nails versus the efficiency of someone who becomes a really expert nail maker and sells them to everyone else, and how specialization actually improves our quality of life rather than us trying to do everything kind of
Yeah.
ourselves, and improves economic growth. My question is, that's true for individuals, and that kind of makes sense. I would do a really bad job building my own house, let alone making the nails and cutting the lumber for it. Maybe you would too, or maybe you're a secret handyman. Well, maybe we'll find that out in a moment. But is that also true for nations? Is there some aspect of this kind of specialization, and are there trends that countries go through as they advance economically?
Yeah, so countries really are just extension of their individuals, and specialization and what we call comparative advantage work at the national level as well. And what that really means is you see almost all countries go through stages of development. They start out very agriculture focused. They move into lower end manufacturers from there, higher end advanced manufacturing, and then finally into services. And the US economy is certainly no different in this stage, in this progression of development. And you look at jobs, we all used to be farmers back in the day, and then a lot of Americans worked in manufacturing. And now, only about 10% of the workforce is in manufacturing, even though we make a ton of stuff and we still have big advanced manufacturers. But what we do really well is produce those things and produce a lot of services, financial services, professional services, healthcare, you name it, tech, of course. And then we trade for lower value services because other countries are at different stages of their development. They're, say, 50 or 100 years behind where the United States is in terms of that natural progression I mentioned. So Adam Smith teaches us, and we inherently get, I think, that we're better off, instead of doing the low value work that those countries are currently specializing in because of their stage of development. It's actually better for us as a nation and as individuals to focus on the higher value stuff and then trade for the rest. And, Adam Smith was 250 years ago, but that still applies today. And it's something that you want U.S. trade policy to reflect as well. We don't want the government actively saying, oh, we should be in this advanced technology or that. But at the same time, you certainly don't want the government saying, oh, we should actually be doing low value manufacturing, because that diverts resources towards the low value manufacturing. And those are resources, capital and people and materials and the rest, that could be going to the higher value stuff. Again, even in manufacturing, we want to be making satellites and aircraft, not t-shirts. Right?
Sewing shoes together. Yeah. It's the old, like, you're going to get paid more if you're the designer of a smartphone than if you are the assembler.
Yeah, and that
to them true as a nation too.
Exactly, and that's really important for workers too. It is, you get paid based on your productivity, based on the value you create generally, and there are some great charts. I love charts out there showing that, that still applies today. Wage growth really tracks productivity growth overall in the nation. And so you want to be doing high value, highly productive things. You don't want to be doing the low value stuff. It's much better to trade for that. And by the way, people in other countries, in poorer countries, they're actually quite happy to be doing that stuff, because for them, that's a leg up from where they were in agriculture, subsistence farming, or worse, decades before.
Right. It creates, it's a win-win, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of positive sum transactions in trade, which is one of the reasons, of course, why it's so politically difficult, because politics is so much a zero-sum game.
Right. It doesn't equate to our modern politics. All right, let's get to where we are in the here and now. We spent a lot of time this year talking about tariffs. I think from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, tariffs are taxes, although there's been a little dispute in the public realm about that. Give us your perspective. What are tariffs and who pays them?
Right. So tariffs are taxes. I hate to break it to those who disagree, but they're taxes on imports. And if in general, in the United States, there's really two questions about who pays the tariffs, right? The first question is who legally pays, who actually writes the check to the U.S. Customs Department. And in that case, it's usually, almost always, an American company, somebody based in the United States. There's exceptions out there, but we won't worry about those. The bigger question is who pays economically? Because in theory, you could have foreign companies lower their prices to offset the cost of a tariff. And thus the actual price to consumers and to companies stays the same. Or you can have companies paying the tariffs, the importing company, a wholesaler or whatever, somebody in the supply chain, and they end up paying the tariffs because they decide not to pass them on to the last group that might pay the tariffs, and that's consumers. So in general, you see for U.S. tariffs, including during the first Trump administration, the vast majority of a tariff's actual economic cost, not just who's stroking the check to customs, is being paid by American companies and consumers. The question about who exactly and when is going to be very product specific, but it doesn't really matter economically. It matters politically, right? Higher prices are very politically sensitive at the grocery store, at Walmart, whatever. But economically, really the same types of things happen. Companies that are paying those taxes, well, those are people, right? Companies are made up of people, and they will have to find a way to offset that cost. So either their shareholders pay, or their workers get lower wages, or they invest less in new projects. So it's just a corporate tax. Somebody's going to pay. Or again, it's U.S. consumers footing the bill. This time around, the research shows so far, it's very early, you're still looking at American companies and consumers paying around, say, 90% of the tariff cost.
Yeah, we monthly track import prices right before tariffs. Yeah. We haven't seen this big downward shift.
Exactly. Yeah, we get import price data every month. The Commerce Department just published it last week. And if foreign companies were generally, so overall, paying the tariffs, what they'd be doing is lowering their prices. And you'd expect to see that chart kind of heading down. It's flat, if not even a little up, which tells us that generally we're the ones footing the bill.
So if it hasn't been passed on to consumers yet, you kind of described this. You have the producer, the importer, the company, and ultimately the consumer. Yeah. Let's focus on that middle, that business as a moment. Obviously, there are lots of different importers in the United States. You and I have talked a little bit before about the differences of the impact of maybe a really large company, which has lots of levers to pull, and small businesses. I always find that policymakers are surprised that there are about 240,000 small businesses who import every year. That's a lot of small businesses. Tell us a little bit about how this impacts them.
Yeah, so I think there's two big points here. First is that one of the reasons economists don't like tariffs is because tariffs aren't just a tax on imports. They actually tend to increase the price of domestic goods as well. So you put a tariff on steel, and then this American-made steel goes up in price as well. So as a importer or as a consumer of steel or any other imported good, you're going to be paying not just more in terms of tariffs, but you're going to be paying higher prices as well, and consumers do that. But the other thing that's critically important is that large companies have a big advantage in this system. So large companies have more market power, more negotiating power for their suppliers. So maybe a giant company like Ford can negotiate with a big U.S. steel company or a foreign steel company, but smaller companies, they don't have that leverage. Large companies can rejigger their supply chains abroad to find the lowest tariff destination, because we have now a system of very wildly different tariffs on different products, and they can hire lawyers and accountants and others. I used to do this work that to find the lowest possible tariff cost for themselves. But that and small businesses, they don't have that luxury, those resources, right? And then the other thing is that for large businesses, they have much more access to capital. They can have much more access to a lobbying system. They can go lobby the government for exclusions, or they can lobby to have tariffs put on their competitors. And again, the little guys don't have that. So what you see with tariffs, and another reason why our economists don't like them, is that they tend to favor big established incumbent companies at the expense of smaller, more nimble, more innovative companies and that don't have the capital. They don't have the alternative suppliers. They don't have the lawyers and the accountants. And that's not just bad for those small businesses, but it's bad for people even considering getting into the business. So potential entrepreneurs. And so you see tariffs can actually be a tax on mobility and on entrepreneurship and on small companies becoming big companies, right? That's kind of what you want as a small company. You don't get to do that either.
Yeah, we ran some numbers at the U.S. Chamber, and if we looked at those nearly 240,000 small business importers, if they were importing the same level, if we just make that assumption, that is an assumption, at the current tariff levels that we're at today, it's a $200 billion annual tax increase. That's real money for those 240,000 small businesses.
Yeah.
One of the other things that people don't tend to think about in when we talk about trade is I think in the popular imagination, there's this idea that it's a finished good, meaning that it's something that we import that shows up on the shelf that I buy.
Yeah.
And therefore, if we weren't buying it, we would be manufacturing it here and that there are benefits to that. I want to get to the manufacturing side in a second, but is that kind of common perception true? Are we really importing a bunch of finished goods?
No, in fact, it's really wrong. The reality is that about half of everything we import into the United States are capital goods, equipment, energy, and other things. So things used by American companies to make other stuff and American manufacturers to make other stuff. That obviously is bad for those downstream companies because when tariffs come into play, because they end up, it's basically a tax on manufacturing. The other thing, though, I think it's critically important along similar lines is we think of trade as between two totally separate entities. So there's a foreign company X and an American company Y, but oftentimes it's companies trading with themselves and they're trading with a lot of these inputs. So you take a company that makes aircraft, for example, and is buying from its overseas affiliate in Europe. It can't just suddenly, in response to a tariff, run out to the aircraft store in the United States and buy a part. No, it's going to keep importing from its affiliate. It's just going to pay the tax and then pass that tax on somewhere further. So that's just it's not going to change supply chains. It's not going to reshore manufacturing. It's just, again, it's gonna harm companies and individuals in the supply chain.
Yeah, and it really picks winners and losers. I was talking to a CEO of an American company that happens to make grills, and they manufacture here in the U.S. And in one iteration of the tariff regime, while they make things here, they get a couple of parts from abroad. The parts were being tariffed, but a foreign country that sold a grill whole into the United States actually wasn't being tariffed.
Right.
So all of a sudden they were being punished for actually making something in America, which was a kind of a picking winners and losers that I'm not sure anyone ever intended.
Yeah, and tariff policy is kind of famous for these types of problems because, let's face it, global trade is very complex. Supply chains are very complex. A company like GM has 3 tiers of suppliers, thousands of companies in its supply chain. And so you could end up with situations where a tariff in one part of the supply chain actually distorts production downstream for some of the reasons you discussed. The other thing that can happen is that companies will work hard to avoid that tariff by doing things that are just wastes of money and resources in a non-tariff world, like importing vans and then ripping out the seats because you can get a lower tariff to do that. And so that's why, in general, just kind of like all taxes, really, you want flat, consistent, low tariffs because that'll avoid a lot of these types of issues.
Yeah, what you described is actually true. Car companies used to import because there is was a 25 is still a 25% tariff on light trucks, which include vans, but not on passenger vans. And therefore, companies would import vans with seats in them. As soon as they hit the dock, remove the seats, send the seats back overseas to import the van
And
back again with new seats, and kept the cycle going.
yeah, it's cheaper than the tariff, but it's wasted economic cost in any other sense. Just a couple of months ago, it was reported that a major airline here in the United States was ripping engines out of jets it had in Europe to bring them back to the United States to avoid paying a tariff on those engines that it could put in idle jets here in the United States. So again, these are not things that companies would do absent the tariff, and they're costly. They're things, that's money that just can't be spent on investment or wages or whatever.
Yeah. I want to remind the audience that in about 5 minutes, we're going to get to your questions. There is a link there on the YouTube channel that you're watching to submit your questions. We've had a number of them that have already come in that are quite good that I'm excited to get to. But before we turn to that, Scott, we'll talk a little bit. The defenders of kind of this approach say, but man, there are things we need to manufacture. There are competitors with geopolitical competitors with respect to China, for example. And early on, you talked about the national security benefits generally of trade. Help us think through those two arguments. Compare the current approach with being concerned about national security issues vis-a-vis today, China, but also the concept of, is this a way to get back to manufacturing? How do you address both those?
Yeah, let's start with I think the manufacturing one's easier. You have to start with the basic reality, and that is that the United States is the world's second largest manufacturing nation in terms of output. We make a lot of stuff here. And in fact, American manufacturing workers are some of, if not the most productive in the world. We make a lot more stuff per worker than, say, China or really anywhere else. But then you have to ask, are tariffs actually a good way to boost manufacturing, whether you need it for national security purposes or for any other reason? And the reality is that in a modern world with modern global supply chains, and given where United States manufacturing already is in the food chain, again, we make aircraft, we make satellites, we make a lot of this kind of higher value stuff. The reality is that a lot of kind of broad tariffs are going to actually weaken the U.S. manufacturing sector in important ways. They will be particularly bad for companies that are global. And so they're very competitive. They export, they import. Well, that's going to increase their transaction costs. It's going to increase their costs, their steel prices or whatever. It's also, though, going to shift resources towards lower value manufacturing. So not only are you actively kneecapping your import-export, your kind of global champion manufacturers, but you're also, by giving t-shirt makers or shoe makers a bit of a leg up, you're actually going to be forcing capital and people and other resources into those things. And that actually is further undermining the advanced manufacturing and the type of stuff you want for national security reasons. So you could actually end up weaker in terms of manufacturing output and the composition of that manufacturing. Vis-a-vis China, some of that applies to China. But the other thing about China is you have to always separate between rhetoric and reality. Right. So even the most dyed-in-the-wool free trader, a guy like me, will acknowledge a national security case for some type of protectionism. Right. We don't want to be buying our tanks and planes from the Communist Party of China. Right. But then you have to ask, well, where are our national security tariffs actually applying? And the reality is they're not just applying to tanks and planes from China. They're applying to tiki torches and baby blankets and a lot of really low value consumer goods that first are very good for American families that are struggling with strained budgets already. But second, don't have any national security nexus, right? And in fact, I would love for China to be just making lots of baby blankets instead of focusing on weapons and other things, right? So, but the second thing is that we're also putting a ton of tariffs on non-China goods, right? We have tariffs on things from Canada and Mexico and Europe and Japan and Korea and Malaysia, China alternative manufacturing destinations like Vietnam. And so we've turned what is ostensibly a theoretically decent proposition. We should selectively decouple from China in certain military or dual use technology goods. Okay, well, we can discuss that. And you turn it into blanket tariffs on China and blanket tariffs on all of our allies, right? So that is not only bad for international relations, but it makes American companies pay more to do business with our best friends abroad. And some of those friends abroad might see that and turn to China, right?
Yeah, almost two aspects of this. One is the alliances, right? We've been broad-based and people who are our true allies, NATO, mutual defense treaties with Japan, we're tariffing them as well. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is this, we're not being selective in the goods. And I agree with you, it would be a very different conversation, but it actually is one of our audience questioners points out, maybe an even more difficult conversation if we were focused on deciding what goods were truly considered strategic. Our listener asks, they agree with comparative advantage and specialization, but they actually ask, how do we decide what is strategic, particularly in a post-COVID world? It feels like it's a hard thing to do, but it's a different debate than what we're currently in this moment.
Yeah, I would love for the debate in Washington to be about what is truly a national security related good. Because the truth is, we actually have processes for this. We have laws that allow the US government to investigate and determine what is a national security related good. We have export control laws that touch on things like dual use technologies, so something that can be used commercial applications, but also defense applications. I would love for that. Unfortunately, the debate today is whether we should have tariffs on bananas and whether Canadian aluminum deserves a 50% tariff, despite Canada being one of our closest allies and having massive comparative advantages in the manufacture of aluminum. And so that's unfortunately where the debate is. And I think the other point that's really important with all this tariff stuff in China, we have to be worried that we're actually helping China in certain ways that with these tariffs. Because if you put a tariff on a country like Vietnam and everything from Vietnam, suddenly Vietnam is less competitive vis-a-vis China, and suddenly people start investing back in China. Right? If they can get a better deal in China even with all the tariffs the United States has, that's what they do. And we're actually seeing, and we've seen before when programs like the Generalized System of Preferences expired, which offered some duty-free treatment to certain developing countries. What did investors do? They went back to China. You see governments say, well, the United States is closed and we need to think about our own best interests. So we're going to engage in more trade with China. So you see the world kind of isolating the United States and moving towards China instead of isolating China and moving towards the United States. And that's, of course, very counterproductive for the very national security stuff our leaders say they're really interested in.
Excellent. Well, let me turn a little bit because one of our audience members, one of the reasons I love them is because they think of things that we should have talked about that we didn't. Yep. And one of the things that we didn't talk about is foreign direct investment. That is the cause celeb in Washington today, celebrating big announcements for investments in the United States. Our audience member asks how the current tariff environment might affect those investment decisions?
Yeah, I think there's a few points. It's a great question. Well, first, let's start with the basics. Foreign direct investment is good. And it's not just good if a foreign company builds a factory in the United States. There's tons of great economic literature that shows that companies with foreign investment tend to be more productive. They tend to pay higher. Foreign invested companies tend to actually boost their surrounding communities and the companies that do business with them. I mean, FDI is great. We want more of it, regardless of its form. Tariffs can undermine FDI in a couple important ways. First is they can simply raise the cost of doing business here. If you are a multinational manufacturer and you're looking to, say, build more cars, and you have two choices. You have Canada and the United States, and you like the United States for its labor policy and other tax policy, but man, you need to import a lot of parts. You need to import steel, or you need steel, and suddenly the United States is much less attractive. So there's a chance that you decide not to build your factory or invest in a factory in the United States because it's such a high cost environment because of all these tariffs. The other thing that tariffs, though, might do is just simply discourage foreign investors from wanting to do business here because of the uncertainty and because of the adversarial relationship. If doing business in the United States means you are constantly wondering what the tariff du jour is, maybe it's what you really need. You're like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to do that. And there's a lot of studies that show that investment and policy uncertainty are going opposite ways. Higher uncertainty, lower investment, foreign or otherwise. But also, you're seeing this what they call the sell America trade out there. When the tariff worries got really out of control, companies just say, look, we'll deal with the tariff. We're gonna stay abroad and we'll just sell into the United States instead of investing there. And that's, a really unfortunate outcome.
Yeah, the uncertainty that domestic companies see also doesn't end at the water's edge.
Right.
Foreign companies have that same uncertainty and maybe even elevated.
Right.
Let's talk about one more aspect of the FDI and this relationship, because there's a lot of focus on trade deficits. It turns out that there's a really, really, really strong relationship between trade deficits in goods and in services and foreign direct investment, such that you actually can't have one without the other. Can you explain that?
Sure. I was going to get into it, but I thought it was a little off topic. So I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah. So basically, the United States trade deficit is matched by what we call a capital surplus. So the dollars that we send abroad, they come back to the United States in the form of some sort of investment, whether it is buying U.S. equities or buying U.S. debt or investing in U.S. companies. And so it is a bit contradictory for the United States government today to be actively courting, if not coercing, foreign investment in the United States, but also very, very worried about a trade deficit because the former is going to produce mechanistically the latter. In general, I should note, most economists don't care much about trade deficits. They can worry a bit about the causes of trade deficits. Maybe governments are spending too much and or more than at least than they're taking in. Maybe there are some weird demographic things where you have savings and investment, because you have an aging society. But in general, trade deficits are not themselves bad. Bilateral trade deficits are meaningless. And I would much, much prefer U.S. trade policy to totally ignore trade deficits and focus on other things because the former, that trade deficit stuff can get you into some bad places real quick.
Yeah, you end up making really odd decisions, just like you would in your personal life.
Right.
If you decided that someone that, if I decide I don't want to have a trade deficit with my barber anymore, I'm going to have really shaggy hair on the next one of these because I'm not going to learn to cut my own hair. As we've already discussed, self-sufficiency isn't really the goal here. Okay, we've talked a lot about how the why free trade matters and why we're a little bit off the rail at the moment. But I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about your views on how we get things back on the right path, and how do you see that going forward from here? And maybe as part of that, if you would comment a little bit on how other countries are actually responding to the US pull away from global trade. Are they pulling away as well, or are they doing something different?
Yeah, I think that the second question is much easier. So let's start there. The reality is that nobody else is following the United States off this cliff. If you look at, for example, free trade agreements, what you see is foreign governments continuing to ink trade agreements, and including very big ones, and including ones that the United States started in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership after we left it. So supply chains are also similar. Companies, individuals, there's not a lot of appetite for autarky and protectionism outside of the United States these days. And that's, of course, it's good news and bad news. It's good news for me because it indicates that, again, this isn't a consensus in the world to turn inward, and because that is bad for foreign policy and economic policy and poverty and the rest. It's bad, though, as an American, because America's competitor countries and competitor companies are going to still have access to that wonderful prosperity machine that is global trade, and we are going to have less of it. And that does concern me over the long term. Contrary to some of the pessimism we hear in politics, the United States economy is still top dog, and we still have amazing companies and amazing individuals. People are still desperate to come here to work and to start businesses. And I don't want us to lose that, right? Because of bad trade policy and other policies that we won't get into today. How we get out of this? Well, as a parent, part of me thinks it's going to be a hot stove type thing. Americans do learn, but really only after we touch the stove and see what the alternative is. And I think that there is unfortunately, I think it's a chance that we're going to need to learn by experience. And I'm pretty confident that that's the case, again, because Americans' appetite for global goods and services and entertainment and culture haven't died down. Americans are still very much into that stuff, even if our government isn't. So I think we're going to keep importing, and there's going to be some problems along the way. The other thing, though, is that, look, pendulums swing. And we always need to remember that in a few years, you could quite easily see the political pendulum swinging back the other way. Democrats, when I was a kid, Democrats were generally anti-trade in Congress. And these days, we're talking tariff reform, not just anti-Trump stuff, but real legal good policy reform on how to get the United States back on track. And when you talk to these folks, they say, look, yes, Trump is part of this, but a lot of it is a realization that maybe our tariff laws give the president too much power. Maybe the protectionism in the Democratic Party has gone too far. And so maybe we're starting to see the pendulum swing back the other way. So maybe there's some optimism that the stove doesn't have to get too hot before things get better.
Yeah, I think that's right, Scott. And actually, I think the good work that you're doing and your willingness to come and join us today is part of how we reduce the amount of time the hand has to be on the stove, right? The more we understand this, the more we can inform ourselves and inform our elected leaders and hold them accountable to this, maybe the less likely that we have to touch that stove for a while. And that, to me, and I think you'll agree with this, is really important because, as you said, we are an incredibly strong economy. We are the envy of the world. And the reality is that when we make these kind of policy mistakes, when we retrench, it's not that all of a sudden we fall off a cliff and we become middle of the pack. It's that we gave up that extra growth. At the chamber, we have a goal of 3% real economic growth, average year over year. That's not a crazy, that's where we used to be, but it takes a lot of work to get there. And the difference between 1% growth and 3% growth in people's quality of life
Yeah,
is pretty meaningful.
it's
And
massive.
getting things wrong, like trade, really does deteriorate that ability to have that massive growth to our own personal well-being.
Yeah, the United States economy has a lot of built-in advantages and a lot of credibility we've built up over centuries of solid performance. I don't expect, and I've said this before, a Great Depression because of bad trade policy. But as you noted, um, but I do expect a little bit slower growth, a little bit higher prices, a little bit less variety, a slightly lower living standards than what we would have had otherwise. The way I always say it is, I could cut off my foot tomorrow and still live and still hobble around, but that doesn't mean cutting off my foot is a good idea. And, that's kind of the case when it comes to trade policy. The United States still has all of those built-in advantages that we're not mucking around with. We'll still be able to produce, but we just won't be as fit and fast as we should be.
Well, Scott, I think that is a perfect place to leave it. We've covered why free trade matters, what we should expect from it, how we've deviated from the preferred policy path, and we've given a little bit of optimism on how we get back to it. I want to end where I began. I want to encourage folks to follow Scott if you don't on social media. It'll be one of these educations like we had today in bite-sized segments. It's a great way to do it. I want to thank Scott for joining us today and the Chamber team for continuing us on this path, really understanding how we keep our eyes focused on what works in free enterprise and how we continue to grow this great American economy. So until the next time, join me in virtually thanking Scott Lincecum of Cato, Duke, and various other affiliations, and join us for our next episode. Thanks so much.